It is the spring of 1944, and you are reading a dead man's diary. You do it every morning. A fresh stack of Japanese notebooks, taken from bodies on islands you will never see, lands on your desk in Hawaii. You can read them because your parents raised you speaking Japanese, and some of those parents are, right now, living behind the wire of an American internment camp on the mainland. A photograph slips from the pages. The handwriting belongs to a boy, and the boy is writing in his final days about the American Marines he was sent to stop. First with contempt, then with fear, then with the respect his own government gave him no words to feel. He was told they were soft. He was told they would run. What he learned instead, he wrote in the dark, certain no one would ever read it. Someone did. You are reading it now. At Pearl Harbor, behind the naval base, the Allied war effort had gathered men who could read Japanese into a joint intelligence center. In the spring of 1944, they sat at long desks, and in front of each of them, every single morning, was a stack of paper that had come off the bodies of the dead. They were reading Japanese. Many of them were Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans, born in California, born in Hawaii, raised in two languages at their mothers' tables. The war had reached into their ordinary lives and pulled them out of it and sent them here to the Joint Intelligence Center for the Pacific Ocean Area, the place where the scripture chapter of the Central Pacific War was supposed to be read. Some of them had said their goodbyes through a fence. While these young men sat translating the private words of the enemy, their own mothers and fathers were living behind barbed wire in camps out in the American desert, held there by the same government these men now served. They did not talk about it much. There was too much work, and the work never stopped. Across the Pacific War, Allied translators would sift through hundreds of thousands of captured Japanese documents, a river of paper that ran to millions of pages. Much of it was ordinary, maps, unit rosters, orders, but a great deal of it was not ordinary at all. It was diaries, letters that had never been mailed, small notebooks kept in secret, hidden by the men who wrote them even from their own officers. And as the translators worked through those notebooks, month after month, the same thing kept surfacing. Not in every diary, the men who wrote them were far too different for that, but often enough that it became impossible to miss. Again and again, when the writer had met United States Marines up close, in a place their side could retreat, the tone shifted, the confidence thinned, the language reached for something it did not seem to have. To understand why, you have to go back. Back before the caves, back before the writing came apart in a dying man's hand. You have to go back to a promise the Japanese army had made to itself about the men it was about to fight. The Japanese soldier did not arrive in the Pacific with an open mind about the American. He arrived with a portrait, and the portrait had been painted for him. His officers had painted it. His school books had painted it. The radio and the newsreels and the training pamphlets had painted it, over and over until it stopped feeling like an opinion and started feeling like a fact. The American, he was told, was soft. He came from a country of department stores and automobiles and jazz music, and he had never learned how to suffer. He fought for wages, not for his homeland. He fought for comfort. Push him hard enough, corner him, and he would do the sensible thing. He would raise his hands. He would surrender. He would run. On the 8th of January, 1941, this belief was given the authority of an official code. The war minister, Hideki Tojo, issued the Senjinkun, the Field Service Code. It was not a law. It was something in some way stronger. A directive that told the Japanese soldier exactly who he was. To be captured, it taught him, was the deepest shame a man could carry back to his family and his village. Death was cleaner than surrender. Death was to be preferred. And running beneath that code, never quite written down but understood by every man who wore the uniform, was its shadow. If we will die before we surrender, and they will surrender rather than die, then we are the stronger, not better armed. Stronger in the one place that decides a battle, stronger in the will. This was not one belief among many. It was the foundation, it was the reason Japanese planners kept sending too few men to hold too much ground. It was the reason they trusted the bayonet charge as a decisive stroke. If the enemy is going to break, you do not need to outshoot him. You only need to push him at the right moment, and he will do the breaking for you. Everything rested on that single idea. And in August of 1942, on an island Most of them could not have found on a map. The Japanese Army put it to the test for the first time against the United States Marine Corps. The island was Guadalcanal. The 1st Marine Division had come ashore and seized the half-finished airstrip the Japanese were building there, and Tokyo wanted it back. The man they sent was Colonel Kuyonao Ichiki. Ichiki was not a fool, and his men were not amateurs. His detachment was built around a regiment that had done some of the hardest fighting in China. They had trained to capture Midway until that plan died at sea in June. Now they were pointed at Guadalcanal, and the staff officer has handed Ichiki their best estimate of what was waiting for him. The American force, they said, was small, perhaps 2,000 men. The real number was closer to 11,000. Ichiki never learned the truth. His first echelon, about 900 men, had been sent ahead of the rest of his detachment, but the decision to strike at once without waiting for the others was his own. In the dark, in the early hours of the 21st of August, he sent those men against the dug-in Marines at a tidal creek, a place American maps wrongly labeled the Tanaru. They came through waist-deep water in the dark, and the Marines were waiting. Anti-tank guns firing canister. Rounds that burst apart like enormous shotgun blasts swept the length of the sandbar. Machine guns crossed their fire over the water. The men of the Ichiki detachment walked into it and kept walking because that was the doctrine, because the enemy was supposed to break. The enemy did not break. By the time the fighting ended, and it went on through the next day, through a Marine flanking attack and a tank advance across the sandbar. The 1st Marine Division put the Japanese dead at around 777. Colonel Ichiki was among them, though exactly how he died has never been settled. By one Japanese account, he burned his regimental colors before the end. And here is the thing that mattered more than the bodies. It was not only that the Ichiki detachment had been destroyed. Armies are destroyed in war. It was that the Japanese army could not bring itself to understand why. To understand why would have meant admitting the portrait was wrong. It would have meant admitting the American had not run, had not broken, had stood in the dark and killed them by the hundreds. And to admit that was to pull the first loose thread from the whole design, the war plan, the doctrine, the promise that this fight could be won quickly because the enemy's will was certain to collapse. So they did not pull the thread. They told themselves the Americans had simply fought harder than expected this one time, in this one place. They sent more men, and the portrait survived. It traveled to the next island, and the next. 2 years later, at a desk in Hawaii, a young man who had learned Japanese at his mother's table sat reading what a Japanese soldier had written in the days before his death. He was reading it in his second language, the language of the country that had put his own family behind a fence. And he was among the first people in the world to see, in the enemy's own unsteady hand, the exact moment the portrait had started to come apart. The first great collision came on a morning of low water, on a strip of coral in the middle of the ocean at a place called Bidio. It sat at the corner of an atoll named Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands. You could walk the length of it in an afternoon. It was flat, and it was small, less than half the size of a city park, and the man who held it believed it could not be taken. His name was Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki. He had a garrison of about 4,800 men. Some were naval landing troops. Some were laborers, many of them Korean, brought there to build. He had coastal guns set in concrete, 4 of them large pieces of British manufacture, bought from the Vickers Company decades before. He had pillboxes, and over their roofs he had layered palm logs and coconut matting so that a bullet striking them would deflect instead of bite. He had turned this speck of coral into a fortress, and he had said, or was later said to have said, that 1,000,000 men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. He did not have 100 years. He had 76 hours. On the 20th of November, 1943, the 2nd Marine Division came for Bidio. The first waves crossed the reef in amphibious tractors, tracked machines that could crawl over the coral, and put more than 1,000 Marines onto the beach, though the fire tore into them the whole way in. But there were not enough of those tractors. The waves that came behind them rode conventional landing boats, and the boats caught fast on the reef at low tide, hundreds of yards out. The ramps went down anyway, and the Marines climbed into water up to their chests, and they began to wade. They waded into everything Shibasaki had built, the coastal guns, the machine guns, the rifles behind the log walls. Men fell in the water and did not come up. The lagoon turned red in the shallows, and still the next boat grounded, and the next men waded and fell, and the ones behind them came after that. Shibasaki did not live to see how it ended. He was killed early on the first day, in the opening hours of the fight he had promised would last a century. What happened over the next 3 days, the record only partly recovered, from the handful of defenders taken alive, from documents and interrogations, from the reports the survivors carried back up the Japanese chain. And out of that material came to something the defenders had not been prepared to explain. They had been trained to expect a certain thing from an enemy hit that hard at the water's edge. They expected him to falter, to pull back, to gather himself and think again and wait. That was how modern armies fought. You did not spend men against a wall that was killing them. You found another way. The Marines did not find another way. There was no other way. Behind them was the reef and the sea. In front of them was the island. And between the two there was only forward. So they went forward, in 2s and 3s, across open coral, in daylight into fire that by every reasonable measure should have stopped them. They crawled over their own dead to reach the pillboxes. They pushed flame and explosives through the pfeifering slits. They did not celebrate a captured bunker. They moved to the next one and read the way the defender's own doctrine would have read it. That was not bravery. A line that keeps walking into fire that is destroying it is not, in that doctrine, a brave line. It is a line that has lost its mind. The defenders of Bedio were not admiring these men. They were trying to make sense of them, of soldiers who seemed to have forgotten that retreat was a thing a man could choose. It was not how armies fought. It was how something older fought, something that had decided the ground behind it no longer existed. Almost the entire garrison of Bedio died in those 76 hours. When it was over, the Marines had taken 17 Japanese soldiers alive, 17 out of 4,800. Along with them, 129 Korean laborers. On the American side, close to 1,000 Marines and sailors were dead. Many of them had died in the water, in the first hour, held there by a reef their own planners had not understood. When the combat cameramen brought back film of the American dead at the waterline, the images were so terrible that the decision to show them to the public was carried all the way up to the president himself. Tarawa was 76 hours long. It taught the men in Tokyo very little, but down in the record, in the fragments and interrogations carried back to the intelligence men, it left the first written trace of a suspicion. The suspicion that the enemy they had been briefed to expect, the soft one, the one who would break, was not the enemy who had just walked across the coral over the bodies of his friends. Now, here is something that does not fit the story most of us were handed about this war. We were told the Japanese soldier fought to the last man because he was a fanatic, because he was brainwashed, because something in him was alien and could not be reasoned with, and there is a piece of truth in that. But the diaries, taken all together, thousands of them, say something harder to sit with. Most of these men were not fanatics. They were school teachers, farmers, clerks in small shops, fishermen, boys, a great many of them, conscripted in the last 2 years of the war and handed a rifle they had barely fired. And when they wrote in their notebooks at night, when no officer was watching, many of them did not write about the emperor. They wrote about their mothers. They wrote about the taste of rice and how long it had been. One of them wrote about a girl back in Osaka who had given him a small charm to wear around his neck. They were ordinary men, and they were writing in ordinary words about an encounter with something that was not ordinary to them at all. 80 years later, the least we can do is read what they actually wrote and not flatten it into a cartoon. 7 months after Tarawa, the war reached a very different kind of island. In June of 1944, in the Mariana Islands, the 2nd and 5th Marine Divisions came ashore on the western beaches of Saipan, with the Army's 27th Infantry Division following behind them as reserve. Saipan was not a flat coral speck. It was a volcano risen out of the sea, nearly 50 square miles of it, with a spine of mountains down its center and a body full of caves and ravines that no airplane could map. And on Saipan, For the first time, there were not only soldiers, there were tens of thousands of Japanese civilians, families who had come out to work the sugar plantations, living now on the same ground the battle was about to cross. The senior army commander there was Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito. The first diary entries his men left behind, captured in the days right after the landings, still carry the old confidence. They describe the Americans exactly the way the pamphlets always had: rich, over-equipped, leaning on their ships and their airplanes because the writer assumed they could not stand and fight as individual men. But in a good many of them, the tone does not hold. Read those entries in order, and inside of a week, you can watch the confidence begin to erode. The writers start to notice things. The Americans were not doing what they were supposed to do. Small groups was the strong points instead of throwing themselves straight into them. Tanks and infantry were working together with a coordination that suggested something unsettling, that the men at the bottom, sergeants up to the corporals, were thinking on their own, adjusting on their own, without waiting to be told. That was not supposed to be possible, not from soldiers who fought for wages. Among the men writing on Saipan was Takuzo Matsuya of the 9th Tank Regiment. He was 24 years old. On the night of the 16th of June and into the 17th, his regiment was thrown into a tank attack against the Marines, a confused, headlong charge that veteran American tankers would later call one of the worst uses of armor they had ever seen. Most of the regiment was destroyed in a single night. Matsuya lived a while longer, and he kept writing. His diary was recovered afterward, and it has been cited in the histories of this war for decades. In one of the last passages, he wrote about what he would do when the Americans finally reached him. He would take out his sword, he wrote, and he would slash and slash and slash at the enemy as long as he lasted. And in that way, he wrote, he would end his life of 24 years. Read it slowly. There is no rage in that line. There is no banzai in it. There is only exhaustion and a strange, quiet acceptance, and underneath it all a kind of astonishment at the thing that was coming for him. Matsuya had been told, like every man in the Marianas, that the Americans could be beaten at the water's edge. They had not been beaten at the water's edge. They had come ashore, and they had kept walking inland, and they were still walking. And a 24-year-old had understood, in the dark with a pen in his hand, that the thing he had been taught about them his whole life was simply not true. He was working it out one night too late. There was one American on Saipan who already knew the whole thing was a lie and who had decided to do something about it with his voice. His name was Guy Gabaldon. He was 18 years old, a Marine out of East Los Angeles, and he had grown up in a Japanese American neighborhood and learned enough of the language from the families around him to make himself understood. And on Saipan, and then on Tinian after it, Gabaldon did something that sounds impossible when you say it plainly. He walked up to the caves, alone, and he talked to the people hiding inside them. He told them they would not be killed. He told them they would be given water and food. He told them over and over that what they had been taught about the Americans, that the Americans were animals, that the Americans would torture them, was not true. And people believed him, not a handful. Over the course of those 2 islands, Guy Gabaldon brought in something close to 1,500 Japanese soldiers and civilians, essentially by convincing them that the story they had been told about the enemy was a lie. 1,500 people chose to believe him and lived. But that is only half of what happened on Saipan, and the other half is the hardest part of this entire story to tell, because for every cave where the people came out, there were others where they did not, where they had believed the story too completely to be talked out of it. At the northern tip of the island, at a place called Marpi Point, the land ends in high cliffs above the sea. And in the last days of the battle, Japanese civilians walked to the edge of those cliffs and stepped off. They had been told what the Americans would do to them. They had been told the men coming ashore were not human. They had been told their children would be tortured. And they believed it because for years there had been no other voice telling them anything else. So mothers went to the edge with infants in their arms and jumped. Whole families walked out onto the rocks and were gone. The correspondent Robert Sherrod saw the aftermath at Marpi Point himself. He was 35, a reporter for Time, who had already seen more of this war than most men ever would. He had come ashore, crossed the island, and made his way to the cliffs, and what he found there, and what he gathered from the Marines and sailors who watched families go over the edge, he put into words. Below the cliffs, boat crews had tried to reach people in the water, tried to pull them out, tried to save people who did not want to be saved because they had been taught that rescue was a trick. Sherrod's account ran in time in August of 1944 under a title that has never lost its weight, The Nature of the Enemy, and it landed on American readers harder than any photograph of any battlefield, because it was not really about the enemy's cruelty. It was about the enemy's belief. It showed in the plainest possible terms what these people had been told about the Americans coming ashore and how completely, how fatally they had believed it. The men in the boats were reaching up to save them. That was the truth. And the lie was strong enough to send a mother over a cliff rather than let that truth touch her. That was the same lie, understand, that had been fed to the soldiers. The Americans are not men. They will not spare you. There is no mercy on that side of the line, so do not go looking for it. It was told to the boy with the rifle, and it was told to the mother with the infant, and on Saipan you could see on the same island in the same week both things it did. It made soldiers walk into fire that would not stop them, and it made civilians walk off the edge of the world. And on the night of the 6th of July, into the morning of the 7th, General Saito gave the order for the end of it. He gathered the last of his strength, soldiers, sailors, the walking wounded, pulled from the field hospitals. Civilians pressed in among them, more than 4,000 human beings in all, and he sent them forward in one final charge. It was the largest banzai attack of the entire Pacific War. They struck the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the Army's 105th Infantry Regiment. The fighting went on through the dark and into the day, hand to hand, close enough to touch. Those 2 battalions were very nearly destroyed. They lost more than 900 men. When the roll was called afterward, fewer than 200 of them were left to answer. And the line held. The men at the front did the thing their training had only ever implied they might one day have to do. They stood, they fired until the barrels burned their hands. When the ammunition ran out, they used the rifles as clubs, and they used the entrenching tools, and they did not give up the ground. It cost them almost everything. But when the sun came up over Saipan, the charge was broken, and the men who had broken it were still there. Which brings us back one more time to those desks in Hawaii. Because the captured paper of the Central Pacific, the diaries, the last letters, the interrogation notes from asylum had talked out of the caves, was carried back across the water to the intelligence center at Pearl Harbor, where the Nisei translators read it. And one of those men who had learned this language at his mother's table sat reading the private words of a 24-year-old from the 9th Tank Regiment who had died certain no one would ever see them. Reading them in the language of the country that was holding his own parents behind wire on the mainland. And what he was reading in that unsteady hand was the sound of the lie coming apart. One soldier at a time, one notebook at a time. The portrait was cracking now. You could hear it in the pages. But it had not yet fully fallen. There was one more island where the men in Tokyo would spend everything they had to prove that the old belief was still true. And it was on that island that a Japanese general who had lived in America and driven its highways and seen its factories with his own eyes was waiting. He already knew the portrait was a lie. He had known for years, and he was about to use the truth to make the Marines pay more dearly than they ever had before. By 1944, the whole logic of Japanese island defense was already turning, away from stopping the enemy at the beach and toward bleeding him in depth over weeks in ground built for killing. It was not one man's idea, and it did not begin at Saipan. Higher command had been pushing the shift, and in the Palau Islands the defenses were already being dug before Saipan fell. What the reports coming back from Tarawa and Saipan did was end the argument. Island after island, the old way had marched thousands of men into fire that would not stop against an enemy who would not break. The portrait of the soft American had cost too much to keep hanging on the wall. They called the new idea Jikyusen, a war of attrition. Pull the Americans into ground so broken and so deep that the cost of taking it would climb and climb until the country back home grew sick of the price and asked for it to end. They could not beat the Marines, so they would try to outlast the nation standing behind them. The first island where the new approach was carried through to its brutal conclusion was Peleliu, and the man who ran it was Colonel Kunio Nakagawa. Nakagawa did not stake everything on the waterline. He laid beach obstacles and firing positions, and he set troops to contest the landing and make the Americans bleed for the sand. But he kept the heart of his defense inland. In a spine of coral ridges the Marines would soon rename Bloody Nose Ridge. For months his engineers, some of them miners brought in for the work, had blasted hundreds of positions into the rock. They linked them with tunnels. They fitted some entrances with steel doors. They stacked one cave above another on the same ridge face, so that when Marines came at the lower opening, the one above could kill them from behind and above. On the 15th of September 1944, the 1st Marine Division came ashore. Their commander had told them it might take 3 or 4 days. It took 73. The terrain was a nightmare no one had prepared them for. Not jungle, not sand. Sharp coral pushed up out of the sea, jagged underfoot, honeycombed with holes from which a machine gun could open up at any angle. The heat on that bare rock climbed past 115 degrees. Canteens ran dry. Water brought up in old oil drums arrived tasting of gasoline and left men doubled over with dysentery. Chesty Puller's regiment, the 1st Marines, was chewed up so badly in the first days that it had to be pulled off the line entirely. And up in the caves, Nakagawa's men were rightin' too. Their records survived them, and the tone in the pages had changed one more time. The contempt was gone. The confusion was gone. What replaced them in many of the writers was something almost like arithmetic. A cold, exhausted respect. They wrote about lying in the dark, listening to the Marines working below them at night. And the Marines were not shouting. They were not wasting ammunition. They were digging, running wire, filling sandbags, getting ready for the next day the way one writer put it, Japanese engineers prepared for a siege. There is a word that runs through Japanese soldier writing of this war. Kakugo. It is hard to carry into English. Resolution, maybe. Settled determination, the acceptance of a thing that is coming and cannot be turned aside. It is not a word of victory. It is the word of a man who has done the math and keeps going anyway. The defenders reached for it about themselves. And in the mood of these late battles, you can feel that same settled acceptance beginning to shade the way some of them wrote about the Americans too. By the middle of October, Nakagawa was down to about 1,100 men. He had bled the 1st Marine Division at a rate that shocked the senior American command. In the end, that division took roughly 6,500 casualties before it was withdrawn and replaced by soldiers of the Army's 81st Division. Peleliu was not declared secure until the 27th of November. In the final days, Nakagawa burned his colors, destroyed his papers, and took his own life in his cave. Tokyo promoted him 2 full ranks in death. His last message went out over the radio with no triumph left in it at all. "Our sword is broken," he reported, "and we have run out of spears." Then he sent a single word, twice. Cherry blossom, and he went off the air. His death did not do what Tokyo had hoped. The Americans did not lose heart. But Peleliu proved the thing the record had been circling for 3 years. A commander had studied the enemy honestly. He had built a defense designed for one purpose, to make the Marines pay, and he had run it brilliantly against an enemy he no longer underestimated. And he had still lost. The conclusion that the side was hard to escape. There was no breaking point for the Americans that could be reached by casualties alone. The only question left was how much Japan was willing to spend to prove that point one more time. The answer was waiting on an island of black sand, and the man waiting there understood the Americans better than any general Japan had. His name was Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. Kuribayashi was not like the others. In the late 1920s, he had lived in the United States, sent there as a deputy military attaché. He had spent time in Washington, in Boston, at Fort Bliss in Texas, and Fort Riley in Kansas. He had bought a car and been taught to drive by American officers, and he had driven it across the country, across the plains, through the towns, past the great factories of Detroit, turning out steel and engines by the thousand. And he had written home to his wife that the United States was the last nation on earth Japan should ever fight. because its industrial power was beyond anything the planners in Tokyo were prepared to imagine. For warnings like that, some of the hardliners around Tojo took him for a defeatist, and in the summer of 1944 he was sent to defend Iwo Jima, a posting almost everyone understood to be all but hopeless, with no real prospect of reinforcement, of evacuation, or of victory. Kuribayashi did what almost no one before him had done at scale. He read. He read every report he could get on the American landings: Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, Guam, Tinian, Peleliu. He read captured American manuals when his officers could lay hands on them, and he concluded that the old way was suicide with nothing to show for it. He forbade the Great Banzai charges. He forbade a last stand at the water's edge. He ordered his men, the 109th Division and the naval units attached to it, some 21,000 in all, to dig. By the time the Marines came, that small island held an estimated 11 miles of tunnels, hundreds of caves woven into one enormous underground fortress. Kuribayashi's letters home survived, and they were later published in Japan and carried into English. In them, and in what his staff remembered him saying, is this the clearest any senior Japanese officer left of what he had concluded about the enemy coming for him. Alaska's productive powers, he said, were beyond their imagination. Japan had started a war with a formidable enemy, and they would have to brace themselves accordingly. That is the voice of a man who had done the reading his superiors refused to do. Before the battle he gave his men their vows. 6 of them, the 5th was exact. "We shall not die," it read, "until we have killed 10 of the enemy." They did not kill 10 each, but they killed enough. When it was over, nearly 7,000 Americans were dead on Iwo Jima. Almost 20,000 more were wounded. It is the only Marine battle of the entire Pacific War in which the American casualties, the dead and the wounded together, outnumbered the Japanese. The garrison died very nearly to the last man. Kuribayashi himself is believed to have fallen leading a final attack in the dark on or about the 26th of March, 1945. His body was never identified. His last message home was a poem about the regret of leaving his country undefended. And in the caves of Iwo Jima in those last weeks, men were still writing. Not all of them read the same way. Some men wrote to the very end in the old language of duty and hatred and the emperor, but others, at the time they were writing in those caves, had stopped performing for anyone at all. They wrote about thirst, about the water running out, about the garrison shrinking around them hour by hour, and some of them wrote about the Marines below them without heat, the way a man writes about weather he cannot change. They were doing their work. The way men do work, they have decided, will be finished. Most of those diaries did not outlive the men who wrote them. Marines took them off the bodies in the caves and passed them up the intelligence chain back to Pearl Harbor, where they were translated, and on, in time, to Washington, into archive boxes. And there most of them stayed, not sealed by any order, just untranslated, uncatalogued, of interest to almost no one once the shooting stopped. Some were rendered into English, circulated, used in war crimes work, folded into the official histories, far more simply sat, boxed, and quiet for decades. The country wanted victory, and then it wanted to move on. The private paper of dead enemy soldiers was not what a grieving, triumphant nation went looking for. They are among the most honest things we have from the other side of that line. Not one answer, but thousands of separate ones. Some of the men who wrote them discovered that everything they had been told about the Americans was wrong. Others held on to the old beliefs to the last breath. They do not speak with a single voice, and it would be dishonest to pretend they do. But I read enough of them, and a thread runs through the pile. Ordinary men in the last months of their lives discovering who they were actually fighting and writing it down by candlelight in caves they already knew they would never leave. They wrote it certain that no one would ever read a word of it. Someone did. You just have.